for actually allowing me to actually come and have this honor of actually speaking before everybody that's here. We talk a lot about holiness, and a lot of times when you hear discussions of it, they'll say things like, well, becoming holy is essentially like becoming godlike, which is true. Or they will say it's bringing our life into conformity with the life of Christ, which is also true. But a lot of times that's pretty nebulous for a lot of Catholics who don't really know what that even really looks like. So I thought before I would actually talk about how spiritual warfare actually helps us to gain holiness in the process of our own spiritual advancement, I thought it would be a good idea just to talk a little bit about what holiness actually is in order to achieve an end, which is what our holiness actually is. In fact, the authors before the Second Vatican Council used to refer to the mark of holiness of the church as the finality for which the church was actually created, that is, for us to become holy. I thought it's good if in order to know the end, we have to first know the end, and then from there we can know the means to the end. It's hard to direct a means to the end, which is quite important because there are specific means that are employed in the spiritual warfare by which we become holier. So I thought it'd be a good idea, let's talk about the end first, and then we can see how we can conform to that. So what is holiness? Well, sanctity, if you actually look at the way the authors talk about it, they say that it is basically that we have excellence in grace, right? So what grace are we talking about? We're talking about sanctifying grace. So what's the definition of sanctifying grace? Well, the definition of sanctifying grace, and don't worry, there's not an exam after this. The definition is an entitative habit residing in the essence of the soul by which we participate in divine nature. Okay, I want to unpack that just a little bit. Entitative habit means that it's a real thing. It's something that we have. Sanctifying grace qualitatively changes our soul. Unlike Martin Luther, who just said it was God's perception that changed, which is rooted in falsity, right? That's one of the ways we know it's almost diabolic in its nature, that we're wretched for all eternity, but it's just how God looks at us. How is that not any different from the way the demons kind of feel, right? In some degree. But it qualitatively changes us. What's this quality? Well, God is goodness itself, and we know that what pleases us is what is something that is actually good. And so when something is good and it pleases us, right, so then basically that's what grace actually does, because if we participate in divine nature, we are participating in God's goodness, and as a result of that, God is pleased with us. You see, most people don't make the distinction between the fact that God loves all of us and the fact that there are some people he's pleased with and some people he's not. And anybody who is a parent of a teenager knows that distinction, right? And so this is a key point, because even though God loves us all and he's working for our salvation, the fact of the matter is that those of us who are in the state of sanctifying grace, and the principal way we first come into it, getting that first grace, is through baptism. And then if we lapse into mortal sin, then we have to go to confession in order to be brought back into the state of grace. But it means that this quality that is in us, this participation in divine nature, means that there's kind of a supernaturalization of the individual. We're not God, but we participate in his divine nature in some way. And they've talked about how this is a mystery. We don't really know exactly how this actually works. But we do know certain things from the definitions of the church and the way that the saints and theologians throughout history have taught, that it's sanctifying grace that makes us pleasing to God. And it's sanctifying grace, which is, they used to call it the saving union, which basically means because I'm participating in divine nature, God looks at us, sees that reflection of his goodness in us, is pleased, and as a result, he will not cut us off from him. It's our salvation in a certain sense. And so that participation in divine nature is what we want to achieve. Now, every quality is by degree. And how do we know this? Well, the color of your hair is a quality, the saints say, and the theologians and philosophers say. And so there's people whose hair is more blonde than others, people who's more gray than others, some people who's just completely white. And so it's the same thing in relationship to our soul. It's by degree. How much sanctifying grace you have in your soul depends on a few things. And that's what we want to talk about, because that's going to become the hinge issue in relationship to the diabolic warfare. So this degree of participation in angels, how much sanctifying grace they have was directly proportionate to their nature. And that meant that one angel was more holy than another just by that degree of or how high his nature was. And so that meant that's how holy it was. But with human beings, it's a different kind of a matter. The angels got to only do one act of merit in their life. So when they made a choice, that fixed their degree of sanctity at that level, and that which is according to their nature. So they can't go up in how holy they actually are. They can only, once they make the choice, that's it. Now, some of the saints and some of the authors say that when some of the angels fell, it left gaps in the hierarchy of grace. And as a result of that, God created man in order to fill those gaps in the hierarchy of grace. Now, human beings in the order of nature are below the angels. And as an exorcist, I can tell you, their level of intelligence and their ability to do things is so drastically above ours. You realize that we are behind the eight ball, but obviously the big equalizer is Christ. But the point being is that for human beings, every time we perform an action, there's three things that are required in order to increase how much grace we have. So we can actually increase this participation in grace, because we know, for example, Padre Pio is holier than I am, for example. We know that. In fact, one time I was with a group of priests, and I was talking about how merit of one individual can actually gain more on the side of what God is requiring than another person. And I said, and we know this intuitively as Catholics, right? So I told this group of priests, if you had to make a choice between having Padre Pio offer your Mass and one of you guys in here offer your Mass, who would you choose? And one of them said, well, that's not fair. I'm like, no, it's exactly fair. We all know we choose Padre Pio, right? And the reason being is because the holier you are also means something else. It becomes the fact that you're in the state of grace becomes the foundation of merit. What does merit mean? Merit is something that's due a reward. One of the things I get a lot of blowback in, but this is something that most people don't understand. St. Thomas Aquinas says that and actually this is the whole tradition of the church, if you are in the state of mortal sin, there's obviously you can't get yourself back into grace except by going to confession or having a perfect act of contrition, which is an extraordinary grace, according to most authors. So that basically means, though, that if you're in the state of grace, you have to be in the state of grace in order to merit. Why is that? Well, merit means that you're due a reward for something. Well, reward means it's a matter of justice. And as human beings, if we're not in the state of grace, it means we're purely natural in our constitution. And that means that any good work we do is due only a natural reward. It's not due a supernatural reward. But if I'm in the state of grace and I'm participating in divine nature, that means when I perform an action, then it can be actually due a supernatural reward. And so as a result, I can actually, one of the supernatural rewards can be an increase in grace. So if I'm in the state of grace, and then I perform a morally good action, the saints say, and then in addition to that, I then have a supernatural intention, I can actually increase, I can do this for the sake of increasing my state, my holiness or my sanctity or for other graces, and I can actually increase how much of this quality of sanctity that I have in my soul. This is a really important point, because if we're not in the state of grace, we're not due that reward. It's only when we're in the state of grace that we're actually due that reward. And this is why St. Thomas says, does God hear the prayers of sinners? And the sinners is just another name for those who are are in the state of mortal sin. And he says, no, he doesn't listen to their prayers, except insofar as it's necessary to get them back into the state of grace. And by that, he's saying that in the end, it's not due a reward. The prayer that someone does in the state of mortal sin is not due a supernatural reward. This is why demons are constantly trying to get us to fall into that state of mortal sin. It's also why there's so much confusion about grace and the doctrines that revolve around grace today, and especially regarding merit. Okay, But basically what this means is we can perform actions to increase how much of this quality that we have in our soul that makes us pleasing to God, so that the more we have of it, the more pleasing we actually become to God. So what I said, you had to perform good actions. So basically, that means that I'm going to have to perform an action, if it's good, that by nature is going to increase my virtue. You see, one of the reasons why Our Lady's prayers are so efficacious in the sight of God, other than the fact that the saints say anything she asks, she gets, but it has to do with the fact that if you have to be in the state of grace and you're performing the action for a supernatural intention and you're actually performing a meritoriously good act, that means that the building of virtue, as St. Thomas says, is voluntary. But that basically means that every single action Our Lady ever performed voluntarily in this life was morally good. She was in the state of grace, and because of her burning charity, it meant that every single action she ever performed did two things. It increased how much sanctifying grace she had in her soul, and it also increased her virtue. Every single action she did built virtue, which makes her different from everybody in here, right? All of us have performed things that reduce our virtue or affect our virtue. So this is why the authors say that the definition of sanctified perfection, which is what holiness actually is excellence in grace. I have a lot of sanctifying grace in my soul, and the adornment of the soul of all of the virtues. It's precisely in building the virtues that I become holy when I do it with a supernatural intention and I'm in the state of grace. So our goal is to have this excellence in grace. Now, and that means that the means is the virtue. That's where the intersection of the diabolic warfare comes into play, because of the fact that it's precisely in spiritual warfare that we build virtues in a degree that we wouldn't otherwise. You see, most human beings are pretty mediocre in their spiritual life. And one of the reasons God draws, or allows, I should say, demons into the lives of people is precisely to afflict them, so that in the process, they actually have to build the virtue to climb their way out. This is something that we see with possessed people all the time. Some of the most holy people I have ever met are people who are possessed when they fight the battle. But I want to talk concretely about this building of virtue thing, because this is what the demons are constantly trying to get us not to do. So a virtue is something that perfects our faculty and inclines us to performing good actions, right? And there's three kinds of virtues. There's the acquired virtues: prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. And we're going to return to those here in a minute. And then there's the infused virtues. So once you're in the state of grace, God infuses in your soul supernatural prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice. And what's the difference between the acquired virtues and the supernatural ones? The difference is that acquired virtues have a natural end. So for example, if I'm going to do fasting, and St. Thomas even says that the natural law commands all the virtues, and fasting is that the virtue of fasting is one of those virtues, then that basically means that what's going to happen is I'm going to have good health as a result of it, which they're discovering more and more, that if we fast on a regular basis, do intermittent fasting and things of this sort, it actually aids our health. But it has as its end something natural. So prudence, natural prudence, just has in governing our lives well so that we have a suitable life that we could actually live normally, which of course we're seeing that in our own culture there's a complete lack of just suitable living. But the difference between that, the natural virtues, and the supernatural virtues, is that the supernatural virtue has God as its end. The first time I read St. Thomas and he said that charity is the form of all the other virtues, I just scratched my head. It took me a while. In fact, I had to read secondary authors and quite a few of them to finally get the actual explanation of it. And it basically boils down to this: charity is love of God and love of neighbor for the sake of God. It's not just love of neighbor. In fact, Christ said, look, the Gentiles do as much. But it's love of God and love of neighbor for the sake of God. It's under the aspect or the perspective of doing it for God's sake. So basically what that means is that form, that perspective for God's sake, is the form or the perspective under which those supernatural virtues are taking. I'm prudent for God's sake. I'm just for God's sake. I'm going to fast for him because I love him, right? So this is why I'm going to do it. Not just because I want to trim, a trim figure or something like that. That's just a natural consideration. But if all those virtues are infused in us, if we're in the state of grace, why is it that people who are in the state of grace, which I hope most of us are here, why aren't you all acting perfectly like saints and perfectly virtuous all the time? See, as an exorcist, actually, even as a priest, you can always tell everybody that nobody in this room is a saint, right? And the reason you can get away with it is because if you are a saint, you're like, you're right, Father, I'm not a saint. Whereas if you think you're a saint and you say, well, that's not true, well, we already know you're not a saint. All right. So there's certain things you can just get away with. It's like shooting ducks in a barrel. You know you're going to get away with it, right? And you know you're going to hit it, right? But anyway, the question then is, why is it that all of us aren't acting perfectly if we're in the state of grace? And this is where the key thing comes in relationship to the diabolic. St. Thomas says that the supernatural virtues, even though they're infused in us, can only become operative. They can only become active in our lives when we remove our vices or our spiritual defects in the natural order. What does that mean? I'm not going to have a supernatural virtue, or exercise the supernatural virtue of temperance if I'm not fasting, if I don't already have the natural virtue of fasting. This is the whole reason for the active purgative way. We have to do everything on our part to build our natural virtue to remove the defects so that it doesn't block the operations of these higher virtues, he says. This is where demons become very important because they have a twofold relationship to these defects. The first is they use them and they pick at them and they constantly try and engender them in people because they know even if you're in the state of grace, they can block these higher operations just by getting you sucked into these lower defects and disorders. And so this is one of the reasons why we have to really work on that. Even if you're not under diabolic attack and you're not having a lot of spiritual warfare in your life, you have to get those removed so that these higher virtues can become more operative. And then the other aspect that they relate to in that regard is that that is a weakness which empowers them. It's precisely because our virtue has become so unvirtuous and with all the sin that's going on that we're actually empowering demons. In a certain sense, demons do not increase in power. Their wills are fixed, and we don't give their wills more power to act in relationship to us. What happens is through our sins, our defects, and all the things that we're doing, we weaken ourselves, which makes their already static seem more powerful in relationship to us. So it's really our own weakening that's actually occurring in all of these things that we're actually seeing in our own culture. It's very difficult for us to see. I'm going to return to the fact that we're all suffering now, even in the spiritual warfare component, as a result of how sinful other people are. So when people say their sin is private, that is completely not true. Yeah, it might be done in private. We also know it's all going to be revealed at the final judgment. But the fact of the matter is that if by other people doing things behind the scenes in a sinful way, it empowers the demons so that they can start afflicting the rest of us. So there's no such thing as private sin in that respect. The other virtues are the virtues of faith, hope, and charity. And these also, charity becomes perfected by the perfecting of those supernatural virtues, which means I have to overcome those lower defects. So as I start gaining all the natural virtues, this is why knowledge of what the virtues actually are. Some say there's 64. I've looked at other authors. Most of them say there's 64 virtues. Some of those can be subdivided, etc. But most people don't even know what the basic virtues are because we have not been teaching them from the pulpit, unfortunately. But if we know what those virtues actually are, we can then intentionally start building on them. And we have to start doing this in our families. We really have to start teaching the children, this is the virtue you need to work on, and this is why you need to, and this is what it'll do for you. Because virtue comes from the Latin word vir, which means power, right? And so it gives us a power. It strengthens the individual in the spiritual warfare. But then, as I mentioned, the demons try and get us to be weak, because then we're more easily manipulatable. And one of the ways that they actually do it is that in every single vice, there is a psychology that revolves around that particular vice and is particular to it. That psychology is a psychological compatibility that we have with the diabolic, right? Because if we have a problem with anger, then we have that same type of psychology that exists in the demons, and the demons spend an enormous amount of time not just trying to get us to be vicious, but to engender the psychology that all goes along with it so that it's more easily manipulatable, and we become, therefore, more manipulatable. And so there has to be a recognition. There's very often with people who, even if it's a minor defect, sometimes we have to stand back and ask ourselves, what is the psychological compatibility I have with the diabolic? In possession, there's 6 stages of liberation. Stage 6 is actual liberation, but in the first 5 stages, you can actually plot exactly where someone is in those 5 stages of liberation by how much psychological separation they've gotten from the demon that possesses them. And it doesn't become perfected until you get to stage 5. But when they're in the meantime, there's this intermeshing of the psychology, and the demons have a lot of influence in the person and afflict the person a lot. So what this tells us is that if we're going to engage in the spiritual warfare effectively, we have to overcome our defects. The second component in relationship to the diabolic, in relationship to those defects or vices on a natural level, is that I mentioned that that's how the things they use against us. But it's precisely the things that they probe and test to see how bad you are. Because and this is something I learned as an exorcist going in. One of the exorcists that trained me, he said, get ready, your life is about to change. And it's true not only just on the external levels, because you have to start doing a lot more praying to keep the demons from afflicting causing oppression and afflicting stuff external to you. But it also means they're going to probe and test your interior life at every single corner to find out where your virtues and vices are. And this is something which they do. They test it and they use it because they're trying to find out what is this person's weakness. Because once they find out what your weakness is, then they can actually go in there and take you out. And they'll try, even if they think you have virtue in a certain area, they'll just throw it up against the wall to see if it sticks, see if there's a reaction. Okay, so this basically means that God uses the demons in a very specific way. There is a lot of talk today about God's mercy, and it's absolutely true. As an exorcist, the mercy that you see God give to these people sometimes is so astounding. It's stuff that you reflect on for days. It's just seeing how merciful God is to somebody in that liberation process. And he is infinitely merciful, but he's also infinitely just. And this is something that we're not talking about. I think we're heading into a time, and we're already suffering a certain amount of his justice, just by virtue of the fact that as we become sinful, our society is breaking down and things are becoming more and more difficult just to function within our society in a normal fashion. And that's the precursor, right, to other things that could happen if we're not careful. But God is infinitely just. This is one of the things that you see in the lives, and you see in the demons when they manifest, is how exacting God's justice. We already know this from the Gospel of Matthew. In the Gospel of Matthew, it says he will throw you into jail until you pay the last farthing. So God is going to extract justice either in this life or in the next. So that being the case, and my intention is not to scare people, one of the things that you become very much aware as an exorcist is that it is God's desire that we're underneath his mercy. But on the other hand, there's also justice in relationship to things. And one of the things that becomes very clear as an exorcist is that there's certain times when demons possess people precisely because God wants to punish them, the demons specifically. So one time, this demon took possession of this one woman, and I said, you had no clue any of this was ever going to happen because she just took this guy to the woodshed. And he said, no, we thought this was going to be easy. Right? And the fact is that God was using this woman to punish him in a manner as a form of justice, because, as he said in this same case, God the Father goes around. Here we're talking about Beelzebub, which is another name for Satan. He said, God goes around setting me up to get humiliated, right? Because why? His sin is pride, and so God is constantly punishing him in relationship to that pride. This means, as human beings, when the demons attack us, now, once in a while, the saints will say it's for justice sake because of the fact that the person's just evil. But that's not most people that actually are under diabolic affliction. Most people that are under diabolic affliction, God is trying to use it for their sanctification, which we'll go back to here in just a minute. But it also means that God is using it to punish the demons. Part of supernatural justice is to be an instrument of God's justice in those circumstances where it's rightly ordered. This means that in relationship to the diabolic, we are instruments of justice to them. When they have to attack us, or when God tells them, we call it conscription, they're sent in to attack us. It's not just that they get to, and even St. Peter says, Satan goes around seeking someone to devour, but it's up to God to determine who he gets to devour and how he gets to devour them. Right? So it's up to him. And so the demons sometimes are conscripted, we call it, where they're stuck. They have to go in and they have to afflict somebody. God conscripts them, so to speak. And then when they go in to do it, it's not that they don't want to. Sometimes, obviously, they want to hurt us. But once they get in, when the person drives them out, the humiliation is brutal. In fact, in session, the demons will openly admit that the absolute brutality of what they're going through here is nothing compared to the shame and humiliation that happens when they end up back in hell and everybody's ridiculing and laughing at them for having been defeated. The fact is, though, is that we are instruments of justice to them. So one of the first virtues that in relationship to the diabolic battle that we can actually be developing is being just to the demons. They deserve this. Right? And the demons will admit as much. Right? Now, we can't it's justice, it's not vengeance. We have to be careful where we're not doing it because we're getting a satisfaction out of hammering them. It has to be done, this is done for God's sake. But the demons, because that we are instruments of their punishment, but the demons are also instruments of our sanctification. There is not a single aspect of the spiritual battle of which God is not in complete control. None. The first time I came across this, some of you might have heard me say this before, the first time I came across it was, this demon was possessing the woman's lower back, so I commanded him in the name of Christ, what's the story with possessing his lower back, her lower back? He says, I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? And he said, when I came in, he restricted me to this point. Over the course of time, I realized who can possess, how many possessors they can be, the length of the possession, what's going to get them out, the manifestations, when they can manifest, the degree of manifestations, the kind of manifestations, the attacks that they do upon the person. All of that is completely governed by Christ, all of it. And that means, therefore, that it's the same thing, not just in possession, it's the same thing in which most of us just suffer ordinary temptation. By the grace of God, most of us aren't going to suffer from diabolical oppression or obsession or possession. But it means, though, that even in our ordinary temptations, God is using the demons to fashion us in two ways. One, by degree. I mentioned before that most of us are pretty mediocre in our spiritual lives. And it's precisely because demons get in and amplify the strength of the possession, and we have to fight it, and it's harder to fight when it's them than when it's just our own flesh or when it's just the world, and we have to fight them. It requires a lot more strength and application of the will in that regard. As a result, the demons increase our virtue in the will and in our lower faculties. It increases fortitude. You have to fight your way out of this particular thing at times. Right? And so he sends them in to increase our degree of virtue. But then he also sends them in to determine which virtue he wants you to have in that moment. I mentioned that sanctified perfection was excellence and grace and the adornment of the soul of all of the virtues. So he wants all of us to have all of the virtues. But in heaven, there's only two individuals that have the plenitude of all of the virtues, and that's Our Lady and Christ's humanity. The rest of us have varying degrees of virtue. And this is because God loves variety. Right? And so in heaven, we know that it's just the beauty of all the variety. We see this even in churches, right? Historically, they used to say, oh, well, there's this divine simplicity in aesthetics, and there's this great simplicity. I'm like, oh, shut up. Right? Human beings, that's true. God is absolutely simple, and therefore he is the most beautiful thing that exists. But even within God, all the attributes of beauty are seen within the Trinity and amongst themselves. But that being said, human beings are not too bright. And the more simple a thing is, the harder it is for us to see the beauty in it. And that's why we need a certain kind of complexity in something to see the beauty of it. But in heaven, this is why there's all these different degrees of virtue in heaven. And the reason we know God likes variety, you might have heard me say this, the way we know it is all you have to do is look at all the different kinds of bugs there are. And you know God likes variety. Okay. That means that the thing that you struggle with the most is most likely the virtue that he wants you to perfect so that it is to your glory and in heaven. And this means it's your means of sanctification. God is going to send the demons in precisely to afflict you in the precise area that he wants you to excel in that virtue. As you build that virtue, and if you're in the state of grace and you're doing it for a supernatural intention, that is, you're offering it up for somebody in your family or to make reparation or what have you, but you're doing that, then what happens is it's the very diabolic affliction that becomes the means of your sanctification and building of virtue. It's your path to sanctified perfection, the adornment of your soul of virtue, in a degree that would not happen if this wasn't the case. So many people come to me and they say, Father, God knows I don't want this demon in my life. Why is he still here? The time it takes to liberate people is extraordinarily long now. And there's a variety of different reasons. Part of it just has to do with the fact that most exorcists, especially those in Rome, make the observation that exorcism works ex opere operantis ecclesiae, which basically means from the work of the doer of the church. So it's the sanctity of the members of the church that determine how efficacious exorcisms are, which tells you we are in trouble. Right? But that all being said, it doesn't mean that you still don't fight your battles. But the point being is that it's precisely the fact that people aren't virtuous is one of the reasons I think it's taking a long time, even among people that are working in holiness and becoming very holy. God wants for them degrees of perfection in virtue and sanctity because they're each time they battle the demons as a possessed person, possession's in the body, sanctity is in the soul. And this means every time they fight them and beat them, that means that their state of grace, how much grace, that quality increases interiorly. So they actually become holier. Under duress, demons will admit that they are the instruments of the sanctification to the person that they're afflicting. And at certain times, the person, because they become more virtuous, it also means that if you go back to my observation, it's precisely vice that makes us weak in relationship to them. But these people are eradicating every single vice because the demons are using them, and so they have to. There's no area in their life that they can leave alone, that they don't have to build virtue in some degree. And as a result of that, they start to have that adornment of their soul of all the graces. Now, this means that if demons are actually the instruments of our sanctification because they help us to build virtue, and therefore we can increase our sanctifying grace as a result of that, the demons will admit under duress that they are the instrument of people's sanctification. Once in a while, as the person becomes holy and is beating them up, I'll afflict the demons by just saying, look at you. You just handed this to her, didn't you? You just gave her this by afflicting her and hammering her and by taking possession of her, and he gave her the grace, and now she's just beating you up, and now you just handed her this power she now has over you. Right? You just handed it to her, and it just drives them nuts because they don't have any control of it. They're kind of an interesting breed. On one sense, they're being obedient to God by doing what they're supposed to do. See, most people have this idea that demons are completely disobedient. That was true in their first choice. After their first choice, their wills became locked and fixed in evil, and that means everything they choose and do is in the context of that. But also, The diabolic is they're still angels. Their nature did not change, and it means their natural law did not change. And so that means that the third category of natural inclination is that's the part where the authority structure is built into the minds of the angels and into men. We know it's built into our minds because children, other than the fact that once in a while they disobey, as a general rule, obey. And they know that when their parent tells them stop that they have to stop it. And one of the ways you know it is even when they're just 2 years old and they don't fully understand stuff, they're reaching into the cookie jar watching you because they know they're supposed to be obeying you, but they're not doing it, right? Okay. But with demons, this authority structure is so absolutely clear in their minds that when something comes into their mind, it burns until when God tells them you must do X. They know they cannot disobey him. There's no point in talking about it. There's no negotiation, right? You just do it and get it over with. And so they want to do it as quickly as possible. But basically what this means, though, is so in one sense, they have to, in some cases, they have to possess because they're told to. And a lot of times they can't get out because God won't let them out. Even though they want to get out, they can't. They have to obey him and stay around. But it also means that they're compulsive, right? They can't help but want to hurt us and to do these things. So this basically tells us something. In a culture, in a society, and in our church, how powerful the demons are, therefore, is directly proportionate to the sanctity of the members of that culture or church. That's what that means. So it's not looking good. Most people in our culture now whether they fully realize it or not is another matter, but most people in our culture and even in the church are leading habitual lives of mortal sin. And this means they're empowering the demons, and as a result of that, it's harder for us. But this is something that tells us something a little bit about the wisdom of God. We are told by certain prophecies that in the end time there would be these great saints, right, that would be raised up. And part of that has to do with the fact that in the end times, I'm not suggesting that we necessarily are, I'm not saying we're not, but it's looking pretty bad. I mean, when you hear about the end times, it's like, kind of looking like it. But the point being is that as things get worse, there is greater opportunity for sanctification for us. Because we have to rise to a level of virtue. We have to start working on sanctity and achieving that sanctity if we are going to survive just living in our culture, right? Just to be able to function and keep your sanity. I mean, the very fact that in our culture we allow two people of the same gender to get married is a sign that our culture has lost its marbles, right? And this is an indicator to us that all of us can lose our marbles too. There's a company that's actually going to start putting out my memorabilia, and one of them is a mug that says sin makes you stupid, right? But in the book that I just got done writing, I actually talk about how sin actually can cause mental illness. And the more we do that mental illness is also a psychological compatibility with the diabolic. But as things become more and more evil, it also means that our opportunities for sanctification, grace, and growth in virtue are even better than they were in the past. Because we have to fight. To live in this culture and to live a normal Catholic life takes a higher level of virtue than it did 100 years ago. And this is an opportunity for us. Diabolic attack is actually a sign of God's predilection. It sounds so counterintuitive. You would think that if God really loves somebody, he would keep them from any form of diabolic attack. That's only true in heaven. Because the demons are the instruments of our sanctification in this life, they become the means by which we grow holy, and so God will allow them to attack us. St. Thomas says there's three kinds of goods. There's goods of the soul, like your state of grace and your virtue. There's goods of the body, like your health and things of that sort. And then there's goods, he calls it euxtenos, which is those things around us, our possessions, our property, our reputation, things of this sort. And St. Thomas says God is willing to allow suffer the detriment to those last two for the sake of the first. And so people who are possessed, They very often are under diabolic oppression because they're attacking their externals, and so that third kind is under attack. They're under attack bodily because of the fact that possession's in the body, and from once they possess a part of the body, they can afflict the person even and attack the faculties of their souls, like their imagination, their emotions, in ways that is just brutal. But God's willing to allow that because then he gives them the grace in their souls, but specifically gives them actual graces in their minds and their wills. Actual grace enlightens the mind and strengthens the wills. And this means that God wants to give those people levels of grace, because to combat the diabolic, as I mentioned, requires even stronger effort than it does just to build natural virtue. He's going to give them higher levels of grace, and grace is one of the most precious things that God can give to anybody. And so as a result of that, he gives those more precious things to those people who are under diabolic attack and affliction. Now, don't go out and ask for diabolic attack. But you just have to recognize, because, as I mentioned, the spiritual warfare is at God's discretion. You don't step into a battle until your commander says, hey, go to battle, right? You wait until it comes to you. So if God sends it to you, then you know, okay, if this is what my struggle is in life, this is the area of spiritual battle that God wants me to perfect. It's the virtue he wants me to perfect, because through that, each time I do this in the state of grace for supernatural intention, I can actually increase my holiness. I can become holy. But that also tells you, we hear very often, and it's very true, our only way out of our problem in the church, especially if the principle that you get the leaders you deserve is true. What does that mean about us as a people, as Catholics? Other than, say, someone like Cardinal Burke or a few priests here and there, or a few bishops here and there, it's looking pretty ugly. Well, but what does that mean about us as a people? And that means that the way we're going to get out of this, if we want, phenomenally good bishops and priests, we have to become holier so that we deserve God giving this to it. The other thing you have to remember is the priests come from the general lot of the laity, right? They were lay people at one point, and so they come up and they work their way up. So the state of those people, the lay people, is going to determine God's going to raise up. Now, from time to time, God will actually raise up and give people specific graces, but generally we get the leaders we deserve. So if we want the spiritual warfare that's going on in the church, because let's face it, what we're battling in the church is not just a difference of ideas. It's evil we're battling now. Because they are trying to push things on us, to promote certain things on us that are right down sins calling to heaven for vengeance and things that are just evil. And so all under the aspect of the good, which tells you it's diabolic. But that means that we're in a spiritual battle. Every one of us is, whether it's just our own personal life, but even in the context of the church. And that means we have to become holier, so that we can combat this. But also, going back to merit, how much your prayer merits, how much your prayers, sufferings, and good works merit, is directly proportionate to how much sanctifying grace you have. So basically what that means is that you have one of two options. If you want your prayer to be extraordinarily efficacious, then you have to become holy. That's the way that you do it. And God preordains, the saints say, God preordains that in order to achieve certain things, he wants a certain amount of merit to be obtained through prayer, sufferings, and good works. But it's the merit, it's the amount of merit. This is why St. Louis Marie de Montfort can say that a single sigh from Our Lady is more meritorious than all the martyrdoms, all the sufferings, and all the good works of all of the saints combined. Because of how holy she is, that one sigh is that meritorious in the eyes of that pleasing to God. So, if you're not getting anything in your prayers, you might be pleasing to God, but maybe not that much, right? And so you need to start really developing your virtue. We do not live in a time or mediocrity that you can be mediocre in your spiritual life. You just can't do it. You're going to get mopped up if you do. Not just in relationship to the general culture or in the church, but you're going to get mopped up in the spiritual war or battle. You have to become holy. And in that process, you'll become stronger in relationship to it. But it also means that this merit, how much your prayers are going to merit, is going to be proportionate, again, as I mentioned, to how holy you are. And so you can actually increase how efficacious your prayers are by becoming holier. And how do you do that? Eradicating those defects. Getting rid of those areas of your spiritual life that are a problem, that are a defect. Getting rid of your spiritual complacency. Praying on a consistent basis. I'm going to talk about that here in just a minute, how you can actually engage in the spiritual warfare, because there's some very basic elementary things that you can do to really start advancing in the spiritual warfare, but then also those very things are the same means to sanctification. So you can either really increase your degree of merit, or you can be shameless, like me, and tell everybody, if you want to listen to my podcast, you have to pray for my intentions. All right. So every time I pray for something, there's thousands of people praying for that. So, okay. But that also tells us something else too. Getting other people, but also getting the saints and the angels involved in the spiritual warfare in your battle is precisely what God wants. He wants them involved in your lives. He wants them to help you fight your spiritual battles. It's just that we don't ask them. And so they literally sit because God wants us to ask them. That doesn't mean that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. It just means that at times they could be more involved if we would just get them to be so. So this means, therefore, that anybody who's going to probably reach high degrees of holiness are going to have to undergo some forms of diabolic affliction or attack. It doesn't mean that it's going to be possession or obsession or oppression. It just means that God is going to allow that person to suffer in certain areas to raise that level of degree of virtue. So how can we combat this, and how does this contribute to holiness? We keep statistics. You wouldn't think that exorcists would keep statistics, but we actually do. And we actually, on average, we have 8,000 people who contact us per year, our society. And out of that 8,000, then we begin this process by which we run them through a protocol. And in that protocol, we start to see certain patterns. And so we watch those patterns and we keep track of those patterns. We actually keep those statistics to find out exactly what are the patterns that we're seeing, because demons, everyone's got this idea that demons are just these things that go around marauding randomly, and it's not true. They are extraordinarily consistent for three reasons. Actually, for two primary reasons. One is their will is fixed in evil, and so they want to perform those particular things that they chose as evil, and so they're kind of fixed in that. The second thing is God, as I mentioned, is in complete control, so they're very consistent in their behavior. Okay, so we can watch these patterns. Well, one of the patterns that we started noticing over the course of time was that the people who were getting diabolically attacked were precisely the people who lacked elementary discipline in their spiritual life. And I mean elementary. What does that mean? Well, it means that about 80% of the people that had diabolic obsession, where the demons are attacking the imagination and the emotions, was because they didn't have any interior discipline in their spiritual life. These are people that are actually going to Mass on a consistent basis, Sundays and even holy days of obligation, getting to confession on a somewhat regular basis. They might even be saying the rosary every day. But there was not, the most notable thing in this was there was a lack of some area of their life, or areas in their lives, where they were every single day practicing self-denial. That's what discipline is. Discipline is basically what? It's, technically speaking, it's a virtue in the will by which we maintain control of our lower faculties and direct them and guide them according to reason. And so they weren't doing that. Most people today, for example, in their eating habits, are completely undisciplined. If the gut didn't burst, they would just, be eating uncontrollably, right? But this is an important point. The point being is that what we started to see is a consistent lack of discipline in these people's lives. So what we did is we designed this protocol. Okay, then you got to get up and say the Angelus at 6, noon, and 6. And there's two reasons we chose the Angelus. The first is because getting up at 6, I cannot tell you how many people. Can it be 7? No, it has to be 6. Well, why can't it be 7? Because it nullifies the whole point, right? the point is, you have to practice self-denial every single day somewhere in your spiritual life. If you don't, then you're going to become spiritually soft. It means you don't have full strength over your lower faculties, and that is a prescription for diabolic victory. We know this just by basic by any kind of warfare. If you have to choose between an army that sits around eating bonbons and talks a lot about stuff, they might know an awful lot, but they're not doing a whole lot and they're soft, as opposed to one that works out consistently every day and practices self-denial and is doing all those brutal hikes and this and that, you're going to go after the soft target. And that's why demons are attacking people. But it also means if you practice that self-denial, then it'll blow them out. So it's that maintaining the discipline of the lower faculties, because the demons know that if they try and attack those faculties, you're going to have the strength from that discipline to say no, right? And so they'll get defeated, so they're going to stay away from you. But it also means that in that, the other aspect of the reason we chose the Angelus is because we started noticing as a pattern that the liberations in people's possessions all started to revolve around one of two doctrines, either the doctrine of the incarnation or the passion and death of Christ. And so that's one of the reasons we started putting people on that. So we have them say the Auxilium Christianorum prayers and the Angelus 6 noon and 6. And what we started to notice is just by putting people on that prayer prescription, 80% of people who suffer from diabolic oppression and obsession cleared it out within 2 to 3 months. But that tells us, right? That tells us, most of the time you don't need to see an exorcist. You don't even necessarily need to see your priest. What you need to do is you need to just start practicing elementary discipline. It has to be something you have to teach your children. There has to be some area of self-denial where they're doing it every single day so that they have that strength interiorly to engage in the spiritual warfare. You can also say a variety of different prayers. Another thing that you can start doing, and this is the kind of the last thing, if advancing in holiness, by the way, so if your prayers are more efficacious, right, because the fact that they have more merit because you're holier, it also means that the holier become, the more your prayers are going to be efficacious in the spiritual battle and the spiritual warfare, so that you don't have to pray as much to get the demons beat up and get them out, right? And we see this, right? So the fact that St. Catherine of Siena, one of the most holy women in history, walks into a public square and tells Satan, get out, and boom, he's out, right? And here I am saying the ritual over and over and over again. Which, by the way, Catherine of Siena has shown up. Not that I've seen her, but the people who are possessed have seen her. But anyway, the point being is this tells you that holiness gives you the ability to drive the diabolic out and to engage in the battle in a much more efficacious fashion. But that means that you have to overcome those defects and start building those virtues and start working on that so that you become holy. You reach that sanctified perfection, which I mentioned. And that means that you're going to have to discover what your defects are. See, the demons can block you from seeing what your problems are and what your defects are. So what you need to do is ask Our Lady of Sorrows, specifically under that title, reveal to me what is the foundational defect that your son wants me to work on. More than likely, you're going to discover something that you had never seen before. And you'll take that one out, and then all the other issues in your life are going to change. They're going to become much easier. And so it's the most efficacious means. If you're going to root out your defects, you have to know what they are. Everyone from Socrates through all the spiritual writers say, know thyself. You have to know what your defects are, and that means because we're extraordinarily blind to ourselves spiritually, we need the grace from Our Lady to do so. So ask her to reveal what that defect is, and then you can start building the virtues that are opposite of that, overcome that defect. You'll get greater strength. The spiritual battle will become easier. You actually might even eradicate certain demons out of their life as you build the virtue, the psychological compatibility that you have with demons as a result of the defect evaporates. It starts to change. You'll get more intellectual clarity, all of it. And so I'll leave you with this. I mentioned that diabolic attack is sometimes the sign of God's predilection. It's a sign that he loves all of us here. All of us have to deal with just the diabolic nature of what's going on in our church and in our culture. But it also means that if we respond to God and be faithful to grace, which is one of the principal ways of growing holy, if we do that, then our ability to grow in holiness, the opportunity for holiness and the profundity of our holiness beats almost every generation before us. And so I'll leave you with the words of, I believe it was St. Paul. I always tell people, I'm a Catholic, not a Protestant. I don't know where that came from in the Bible. But the words of St. Paul, engage the ancient serpent and win the crown of glory. God bless you all. May Mary keep you.